Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. And the question is this. If Bach's music is supposed to be spiritual, then why isn't Haydn's and Dvořák's considered spiritual? Now, the interesting thing about this question isn't just the fact that it's worthy of discussion, but it's the source of the question, which is nothing less than the evil god Cancrizans himself. See, we were having a chat the other day, Cancrizans and I, and in case some of you don't know who Cancrizans is, he is the evil god of classical music, who has declared that he's going to destroy all of classical music, but for one work per composer and one recording per artist, unless we can convince him otherwise. Now, we haven't been doing much convincing lately, but there are two big playlists called If I Could Choose Only One Work, or If I Could Choose Only One Recording by Artist X, Composer Y, it would have to be. And Cancrizans is busily working through some of the 100 and some odd recordings and works that we've come up with. So we're keeping him busy, and he's having a very good time, he said, actually. He hasn't decided not to preserve all of classical music, but for one work, but he's getting there. We're going to have to revive those series at some point and just to, feed him some more stuff. But anyway, he and I were having a chat, and he said to me, Dave, he said, I don't get all this spiritual crap. He said, I'm a god. I can defy the laws of physics, but my existence is a fact, and the things I can do are issues of science, not issues of spirituality or transcendentalism. What are these people talking about? And why are they so selective? Why do they always talk about Bach is spiritual, and never the composers I really like Haydn and Dvořák? Well, I said to Cancrizans, complimenting him on his superior musical taste and perspicacity, because you always have to sort of butt stroke the gods. You know that very well. I said to him, I'm going to try to answer it, and I'm going to answer it for everyone, because I believe that the wisdom of Cancrizans should be spread as far and wide as it possibly can be. So here's my take on it. And we'll see if Cancrizans is satisfied. I mean, if you see earthquakes or convulsions of nature, then you'll know we didn't get the job done. Anyway, here is as far as I could tell. The reason Cancrizans asked this question is because there was a comment. The comment was about the pianist Long, of all people. And it was something like, I'm very disappointed in him because after he did the Goldberg variations, he had touched the spiritual and he never pursued the spiritual depth that particular effort seemed to promise. Well, where do we begin? First of all, the Goldberg variations is about as spiritual as a set of Legos. I mean, that's what it is. It's a construction like Legos that people put together. You take the blocks, you stack them up, and voila, Goldberg variations. Now, this does not mean it's not a stunningly fabulous masterpiece. I'm not suggesting that at all. But it is a piece of musical manufacture. The spirituality of content within the Goldberg variations, there's no evidence for that at all. I mean, if some people are moved, that has nothing to do with what the work is. That has to do with what it does to certain individuals. And my experience with those individuals is that they hear themselves, they view themselves as spiritual beings, and therefore anything that moves them is described similarly as spiritual. That has nothing to do with any kind of reality, because spiritual has to be the most debased term as it's used in all of music. I mean, totally meaningless. Absolutely, totally meaningless. I did a video on what makes music spiritual. It's not a secret. It's just a certain selection of ingredients. You need to have a combination of dynamics and harmonic practice and textural complexity that makes the music not sound like a human voice. The less human and the more alien it sounds, the more spiritual it's going to be. It's really that simple. And if you mix those ingredients together, poof, you get spiritual music. So it's probably true to say that music which is in that sort of alien category is going to be regarded by a lot of people as spiritual. But goodness gracious, the Goldberg Variations, no way. I mean, please. And if it's vocal music, by the way, then you're very good using a chorus, because a chorus is a suprahuman voice, right? The voice of the multitude. I mean, it's all in this video. I don't have to go through it all over again. That's why Renaissance choral music is spiritual, because it's rhythmless and it has vocal interplay of polyphony and all that. I keep saying we don't have to go through it, then I keep going through it. All right, I'm stopping. So anyway, yes, there's no mystery to what makes music spiritual. Isn't that interesting? Spiritual is not mystical. It's not mysterious, not a bit. But here's the thing. Everybody thinks that Bach is spiritual. And, he wrote sacred works that I think undoubtedly are. If spiritual means anything, then, things like the St. Matthew Passion and the B minor Mass fall into that category, and a whole passel of cantatas, despite their miserable texts. So yeah, I mean, okay, let's grant that. But what about Haydn and Dvořák? Haydn, let's talk about Haydn. Haydn was one of the most devout composers that ever lived. He was an incredibly spiritual guy. Every single piece of music that he wrote, he finished writing Laus Deo or something similar, Praise God, or whatever. He wrote his Stabat Mater as a thank offering to the Virgin after recovering from an illness. He wrote 14 masses. He wrote one of the only sacred oratorios, the Creation, that anyone cares about after Handel. So why isn't he considered spiritual? He even told his biographer that when he was writing his music, he often had in mind moral qualities. I mean, that's what he said. And nobody hears it that way. Is it our training? Is it our inability to access true spirituality when we hear it? I don't really have an answer for that one. I do think it has a lot to do with expectations, with received opinion, with our genuine inability to understand, what composers are after when they write music. I mean, we listen to it, we enjoy it, maybe sometimes, or we don't, or we ignore it, or we think it's... Haydn tends to have a reputation as a composer of fluffy, light music. Music that is not deep, because Beethoven wrote deeper symphonies and other people wrote deeper masses or whatever. I don't know. But it's not fair. It's not right. There's nothing unspiritual. I mean, the 7 last words. Whoa, spiritual, bonk, 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 flashing spirituality. Of course, that was one of his most popular pieces because everybody thought it was spiritual, because they saw Haydn as finally doing something seriously spiritual. Maybe that's the point. Maybe spirituality is an aspect of seriousness. It's always tied up with words like depth and sublimity and profundity and all of those other, heavy duty concepts. And Haydn wants to make us laugh as often as not. And I don't think there's anything more spiritual than laughter. I really don't. I mean, a rabbi said to me once that God has the best sense of humor of all. And I think that's probably, I hope, a valid statement. If our concept of God means anything, then he'd better have the best sense of humor of all. And even Cancrizans, the evil god of classical music, has a sense of humor. I mean, I'm waiting for him to tell us that all this effort we put into doing, the one surviving work and one surviving recording by everybody in classical music was just a joke because he was bored and wanted attention. It wouldn't surprise me. It really wouldn't. I mean, his sense of humor may not be our sense of humor, but it's a sense of humor. And then what about Dvořák, another composer of great devoutness? I mean, a seriously devout Catholic. And I mean, he wrote, after Haydn, the largest Stabat Mater setting that ever existed. His sacred music is glorious. He wrote a mass that is not only beautiful, but also liturgically appropriate, which is almost unheard of. His Requiem is amazing, but everybody ignores it. His Te Deum is stunning, but everybody ignores it. I mean, the biblical songs, those get some attention because they're practical for performance. But very little else of Dvořák. And what about his non-sacred music? Why isn't that spiritual? Why isn't the celebration of nature or his or choo-choo trains, his two big hobbies, pigeons and choo-choo trains? Why isn't there anything spiritual about that? I mean, if you consider the most spiritual composers in the Romantic period, I mean, by religiosity, you've got Franck, who was incredibly religious and devout and mystical, and everybody regarded him as kind of a fool, and his music in bad taste. I mean, his most spiritual music doesn't get performed, like Beatitudes, nobody cares about. I mean, but it's spiritual. And then, of course, there's Bruckner. Oh, good old Bruckner. Bruckner, who is, the king of spiritual orchestral music. But isn't it ironic that when he finally dedicated a work to God, he died before he could finish it? I mean, there's something interesting about that, isn't there? I mean, there are a lot of our whole view of spirituality, it seems to me, is inextricably tied to our rather kitschy concept of religion. That is, religion as something that only deals in matters which are sort of dismal and serious and unpleasant, whereas, when people start to celebrate joy, the idea of spirituality just vanishes. And I find that very, very depressing. I really do, because I don't consider myself at all spiritual. But if I did, and if Cancrizans said too, if I were spiritual, then happy things would be spiritual, really spiritual, as happy as the miserable things. And it's not that people don't regard happy things as spiritual. It's that composers do not gain reputations for spiritual depth by writing music that conveys joy. That joy in the natural world, joy in living, joy in whatever. But just fabulously intense, wonderful, lucid joy. Yeah, that's where true spirituality lies, according to the evil god Cancrizans. And I'm telling you all now, from the evil god himself, that that's his view of spirituality, and that all of this sanctimonious spirituality, this garbage, it doesn't do Bach any credit, because Bach, of course, wrote music of tremendous joy and joie de vivre and vitality and all of those things. I mean, he's a great composer, not because of his depth, but because of his range and his depth. And that's true of all great composers, isn't it? I mean, isn't that what they give us? They give us range, the range of human experience and beyond, possibly, and the intensity, which is synonymous with the depth with which they express it. And of course, Haydn and Dvořák had just as much range and just as much depth as composers such as Bach, but they had a different mix, a different recipe. And that recipe may have included more joy, more happiness, less grimness. One of the other factors, and this is a political factor, I'm telling Cancrizans because I don't think he would get this particularly, I really believe is actually political. I mean, it's the fact that Bach was, first of all, German, and second of all, Protestant. Because, the Catholic Church has an entire raft of spiritual composers. It's a spiritual institution. And composers of Catholic liturgical music, particularly in Latin, are often regarded as part of this sort of institutional coterie of religiously spiritual Catholic stuff. Whereas Bach, as a Lutheran, he sort of gave the Lutherans their equivalent. It was very hard for me to actually understand this part, because I'm Jewish and I don't care. I mean, it's all Christian. I don't, the differences to me are sort of irrelevant as an aesthetic, or as a, political thing. But in the Christian universe, and I say this as a historian, somebody who went and studied all this Renaissance and Reformation and Counter-Reformation and the religious wars and European history. I mean, my field was modern Europe, which means everything from like 1600 forward. it was a huge thing. It was a very, very huge thing. And of course, the Catholics had a certain institutional advantage because they owned a lot of property and they had big buildings and they had a unified, centralized bureaucracy, whereas the Protestants never did. And so Bach is, in some respects, sort of the Lutheran or Protestant answer to all of this the Catholic cultural musical hegemony. There, did I say that right? The Catholic cultural musical hegemony, whatever I said, that's what it was. And Bach really sort of is the bulwark. When the Catholics get together and they say, oh my goodness, we had Palestrina, we had Josquin, we had all those people in the Renaissance, and then we have Monteverdi, and then we have like all these Catholic people writing requiems and then masses and just tons and tons and tons of it. Then all the Protestants get up there and they say, yes, but Bach, Bach, and he even wrote a Latin Mass, and it's better than your Latin Mass. There is an element of one-upsmanship in that respect that Bach has benefited from tremendously. That I can only say as an outside observer that I believe that that's happening. I see it happening. I think there's historical precedent for it, dear Cancrizans. I really do. And that's something that if you're really curious about, I can recommend possibly some reading along those lines. But actually, there is a certain amount of competition in the religious music marketplace. So, and Bach is certainly the brand that everybody wants to go for. So if you're not Catholic, and even if you are, because of course it's great music and we don't care. If we care about great music, we don't care about why it was written or who wrote it. We just care that it's great. And anyway, so that, my friends, and dear Cancrizans, oh great one, is the answer to why some music is considered spiritual, but other music, unfairly, is not. Keep on listening, friends, and Mr. Cancrizans there, you keep on listening to our lists, to those 2 playlists and some others besides. You may very well decide that there's a lot more worth preserving. Take care.